Hey guys, in this video I'll be updating my sacrifice build. This version will be a min-max version with everything rolled basically perfectly. With how the crafting works in the game right now, you will be able to get to this point eventually. There will be not much randomness involved. You pretty much will never break your gear, and even if it does break, you kind of can get it done like very easily. So you just have to grind some materials to get to this point. So yeah, the build does absolutely crazy damage, like over 10 quadrillion DPS easily, and it also has near immortality. And also, like the DPS says, over 10 quadrillion, but in combat, it's effectively infinite damage. And I will explain why later. First, let's showcase what's currently probably the hardest thing you can do in the game, which is full modifiers, maximum difficulty abyss. Technically, you can do infinite, which is even harder, but I'm not gonna sit here for multiple hours. So yeah, I'm gonna showcase the full modifiers. Normally, you wouldn't do full modifiers even with this build. You will not run 90% less hunter movement speed because that's 90% less damage for this build. Because I'm running wing blade, which means um, movement speed is damage. So 90% less movement speed is 90% less damage. And fleeting, because reduced buff duration will make some buffs not up always, which will kill my damage a lot also. And also Mark of Death, because if you get unlucky and hit 10 times, well, you die. So normally you will not run these, but to showcase the power, I will be running all of them. So yeah, um, compared to the previous version, this build uses a lot of new mechanics. That's basically completely changed how the damage scaling, how the defense scaling works, and it does a lot more damage, and it is actually a lot more tanky. Even though you can see I only have 930 HP, which is like about 10% of what I had, right? So this is using completely different mechanics, and it's a little bit complicated, I will say. And also, the previous version of the build has some bugs involved, and it was also kind of outdated because I'm actually designed the build months ago before I made the video, and but after coming back to the game and making that video, I wasn't aware of all the changes that was made. So that wasn't like super optimal of a build, and there was bugs involved that made the build do less damage than it should. But it's still really strong and completely fine to do everything in the game. Yeah. So yeah, as you can see, I can beat like full modifier abyss. Well, almost died from 10 stacks, but this is just RNG basically. 52 seconds, no problem. Basically everything got one shot. So yeah, the build is very strong, does a lot of damage, and is very survivable. And let's first show the build overview here. So I'm gonna mouse over each slate and all the relics if you want to copy it. And I will explain why I'm doing some stuff later. So yeah, that's the build overview. So let's first talk about what was the bug that caused the previous build doing less damage than it should, and how I overcome it in this build. So the bug I was talking about, so first of all, the build actually months ago when I first designed the build, it actually did like probably like 1,000 times more DPS than what was shown in the video. And there was a bug that was causing it to do more damage than it should, and it got fixed. And while fixing that bug, another bug occurred that made the build do less damage than it should. So yeah, that's why it lost so much damage. So let's first talk about what bug that was happening. So this happens in a lot of games. Like any game that does damage based on another percentage of like if it does damage based on a percentage of another instance of damage, this bug can happen. Like multiple games have this in PoE, in like like probably Diablo and like all the other stuff. Like any game that has this kind of mechanics. So if you look at Ignite here, Ignite does 70% of the trigger damages, base fire damage, for 3 seconds, and it's 70% per second, and because it ticks twice per second, it's actually 35% per tick. So Ignite does 35% of the base fire damage of the trigger damage, which basically the hit, or well, it's not hit, it's just the damage, right? Because in this game, actually you don't have to, even damage over time can ignite. Only Ignite cannot ignite, yeah, which is quite interesting. But yeah, Ignite does 35% of the trigger damages base fire damage. So what this means is, let's say I have a base damage, right? Base damage, and let's say I have 100 base damage. How much Ignite should the 100 damage apply? It should be 35% of the 100, right? 35% per tick. So that's 35 of 100, right? It's pretty easy to understand. Now, this is base damage. What happens if you have damage modifiers? Let's say you in your build you have times 10 damage, right? Now, if the damage gets, oh sorry, times 10, now the 100 damage will turn into 1000 damage, right? But how much damage should Ignite do? Now, pretty intuitively, you will think, well, 350 damage, right? That's 35% of 1000 damage. Right? That's pretty easy to understand. But in a lot of cases, this times 10 modifier can be very generic and perhaps global, which means that it will affect basically everything, including the Ignite. So the Ignite will get scaled again, and making it, instead of 350 damage, 3500 damage. Now you can see the problem, right? You only had a times 10 modifier, but for some reason, instead of being 10 times the damage, you do 100 times the damage for your Ignite. And this is what we call double dipping. This happens in a lot of games, and anytime a modifier gets counted twice, it's double dipping basically, right? So this is obviously unbalanced and probably a bug. So the dev fixed it, and now the way it works is, well, you have, instead of trying to get the percentage based off of the hit, you look for the base damage of the hit instead. So it's base fire damage. And this is also how PoE 1 works. So you look for the base damage, which is 100 in this case. So instead of going 100 times 10 for the hit damage, and then you go 35%, and then you get scaled by 10 times again, instead of going here for the bugged damage, you go from the base damage, which is 100, and then get the 35%, and then times 10. Right? This way, you don't scale it twice. Because you still want for the times 10 damage to be able to affect Ignite, because perhaps sometimes you will have Ignite only modifiers, right? You don't want this Ignite to be unscalable, right? So that's how currently how Ignite works in this game. But while doing this, there's another bug that showed up, which made Ignite a lot worse than it should be in this game. And that bug is, well, I think I can just show you directly. So here, let me find a, do I have a, okay, here. So I have here a mana ball with enlarge, which doesn't give me any damage, and there's no damage modifiers on the slate, right? It's only give me 15 skill power. And I have 50% chance to apply elements here, and some other useless nodes. But yeah, here, let's see how much ignite this does. Okay, let me take off some. Okay, take out the fire damage here. $240 damage on the initial tick, right? The tick goes up because there's an aggravation mechanic. But yeah, let's look at the initial tick, 240, right? This is without any modifiers on the slate. Now, if I use the slate like fire, right, it says 30% more fire damage, and this one also has no damage on the slate otherwise. So let's take the enlarge out, use fire instead. So I was doing 240 ignite. With 30% more fire damage, I should be doing 30% more than 240, right? And let's see how much damage it's doing here. Oh wait, it's still 240, right? It didn't get it didn't get scaled at all. Clearly, the fire damage isn't affecting the fire damage on the slate isn't affecting the ignite. Now, this is just the slate itself. What happens if I roll fire damage on the slate? Right? Let's say I use this slate, right? It has 50% fire damage. The other stuff doesn't affect the ignite, so we can ignore it just for the 50% fire damage. The damage should go up. It should be higher than 240, right? Well, it's not. It's still 240. So there is a bug that's going on that's basically any stat that's giving damage that should be giving damage to ignite isn't working correctly. Now there are some modifiers that do work still. So stuff like cohesion, it gives skill power, right? So if I use this cohesion, it's 34% more power and with no other damage modifiers. And you can see it's higher than 240, right? So the skill power does work. And if you think about it, skill power is basically the base damage. So modifiers to the base damage does work, but like the other damage modifiers is not counting correctly. So that's basically the bug. So I lost a lot of damage on that build because of this bug. So yeah, that's why that build was actually worse than it should be. Now with this version of the build, I actually overcome this problem and kind of use it to my advantage in a way. So if you remember, there were blue circles popping up, right? There's blue circles popping up, and what are these blue circles? Well, it is actually the ice explosion from the Eternal Frostite power. So this says hitting an enemy with chill will remove the chill and cause an ice explosion with a radius of 1 and damage equal to 40% of the damage of the hit. And the ice explosion cannot apply chill itself. So this is to prevent it from self-infinitely looping. Right? If it can apply chill, you will be able to keep proccing ice explosion from ice explosion. And that's obviously not good. But it says it cannot apply chill, but it still can apply ignite if you think about it, right? But the ice explosion is cold damage because it's blue, right? It's blue, which means it's cold damage. How do we make it apply ignite? Well, there is an abyssal eye called Arsonist. Arsonist, if you have two Arsonists, you can see all damage types can cause ignition, which means cold damage can cause ignition, which means your ice explosions can cause ignition. So what happens here is, well, because the ice explosion is counted in so it's also a damage effect that's a percentage of another damage, right? And this can be prone to double dipping. But the dev is smart. He's a PoE veteran, so he made this value unscalable. So this 40% of the damage of the hit you will not be able to scale it in any way. I tried many ways. I cannot break it. you cannot make it crit, you cannot scale like cold damage, you cannot scale area damage, like everything I basically tested, nothing works, and I think it's just hard coded to not be able to scale. But that also means that it's somehow coded similarly to base damage. So the chill explosion is, I think, has like this base damage tag, or maybe it's just like kind of coded as it's not modified before, which means if this thing applies ignite, the game thinks the ignite is drawing from a base damage source, which means the ignite will get all the modifiers again. So let's say I do a hit. So here instead of doing whatever this is, right? Let's just redo this now. And my sacrifice, let's say my sacrifice has a base damage of, I don't know, I was still gonna use 100, but it's more like, I don't know, 100 billion or something. But yeah, let's say 100, and I have a damage modifier of times 10, so my sacrifice does 1,000 damage right now. Now the chill explosion comes in, right? The chill explosion does 40% of that, so that's 400 damage explosion. And then actually, let's not use times 10. Let's do like something bigger. Let's say 1,000, so you can see how the effect works. So if it's times 1,000 times the initial damage, which is like this, like 100,000 damage, right? And the chill explosion will do 40,000 damage. Now, if the chill explosion ignites, remember this damage is unscalable, and the game thinks it's actually base damage. So the chill explosion will get 35% of the 40,000 will be counted as ignite, which is how much? 14,000, right? But then this thing, because it's scaled from base damage, will get all the damage modifiers again. So it does, well, 3 more zeros, which is how much? 14 million? Yeah, 14 million dot, right? So you can see what's going on here. Instead of, well, if it's the bugged, let's say like if you get, like if normally if you don't use this, right? If you don't use the chill explosion, it's only going to be 35% of the 100,000, which is 35,000, right? Which is going to be 35,000. And you can see how much more damage this does, right? This is like, I don't know, how much damage is this? Four, that's 4 times, right? 400 times, I think. Yeah, 400 times damage. Yeah, it's 40% over 1,000. Yeah. So yeah, you get the point. It's a lot of damage. So that's why, and I can show you this in game too. So let me turn off the effects so you can see the numbers better. So you can see here, the crits that's going on is from sacrifice because my sacrifice has 100% crit rate. The orange numbers are the crit, and this actually is a B in the end here, so that's about 1,000 billion, which is 1 trillion, right? So that's 1 trillion damage per hit. Now 1 trillion damage per hit how much ignite should it be? Like, even with a lot of scaling. And also keep in mind, all my scaling is actually not affecting ignite. Like, even if it's not bugged, area damage doesn't scale ignite, crit damage doesn't scale ignite, right? Nothing works on ignite here. So we shouldn't see like very high ignite ticks, right? But if I like pause the game right here, pause my skills, see how much damage the ignite takes for? That's multiple quadrillions of damage. Like, that's like 20, like 40 quadrillion something, like 30 quadrillion, right? So Wait, no. Yeah, but you get the point. It's a ton of damage. It's just a ton of damage, and that's why it's happening. And if you remember, while I was doing the Abyss, there were actually um, not only these blue circles popping up, right? Not only these blue circles, there were actually some orange circles in the middle of the blue circles as well. And those orange circles are, well, explosive orb. Explosive orb is a relic that says when enemies ignited by you die, the remaining ignite damage will be converted into a 1 radius explosion. The explosion cannot cause ignite. Again, the explosion cannot cause ignite is to prevent you from infinite looping this damage, right? Because if you do a big ignite, the ignite kills something, all the remaining ignite gets added together to an even bigger hit, and then that bigger hit will cause ignite with a bigger ignite, and you can see that it keeps ramping infinitely. That's obviously not good. So the explosion cannot cause ignite. But the explosive orb is a hit, which means the explosive orb can trigger ice explosions. So the same thing happens again, like what happened here. The this ignite damage times, like, I don't know, like six ticks, right? If you don't have any duration scaling, times 6, well, is then turned into the explosive or explosion, and then it triggers the chill explosion. So this times 0.4 is the chill explosion, and then it gets, well, all the modifiers again because it's the new ignite, right? Because this whole thing will be counted as the base damage. So you can see where I'm going, right? It's infinite damage scaling if you have enemies to kill. And also another even broken thing is, well, the chill explosion is not scalable, but the explosive orb is scalable. So all of your ignite damage gets added together, but this number here, this all the ignite damage, like, that got added together, right? This number, like this number right here, is the explosive orb damage. This thing scales with your damage. This thing is scalable. So this actually is, you're gonna scale this again with this times 1000, right? So you add 3 more zeros in the end. Well, in reality, it's like way more than that. But yeah, it's just like, yeah, it's so much damage, and every time it loops, it's just so many zeros added to the damage, and it's just stupid. And so because of this, we want to scale a lot of global damage, and that's basically why I changed a bunch of the scaling in the build. So let's go over the biggest scaler of the build, which is Wingblade. Wingblade says movement speed bonus also applies to your damage, and this is not specific to additive movement speed. It also includes multiplicative movement speed. So you can see here it's 40%. It also gives you plus 40% movement speed. This is increased, which is additive, right? So this is basically just 40% increased damage, which is, it's good, but when you have so much increased, right, you get a lot. Well, you don't get a lot of increase, especially for global increase. You get like maybe like 100, 200, not crazy amount, because most of the increase will be on your slate, which is local to the skill. So yeah, if you're trying to do the loop and you're trying to scale the loop, well, you want some global increase as well. So that's why we have fire damage rolled on your relics, right? And that's pretty good. That's increased damage. But also this includes more damage, more movement speed. And there are actually some sources for more movement speed, multiplicative movement speed. And, well, first of all, there's the talent I'm using here, time and space distortion. You can see more movement speed, 20% more movement speed. That's 20% more damage, basically. And well, the most broken part is actually, well, you can see on my relics I have haste effect and maximum haste. So what haste does is, if I look at the tooltip, haste does 6% increase skill speed and movement speed per haste. The base is 3. I have, well, 19. I have maximum 19 here. And I have 200% haste effect, which is 3 times effect, right? And it says increased, which supposedly means additive, right? But for some reason it's multiplicative. I don't know if it's a bug, if it's intended, if it's just translated bad or something. But yeah, it's multiplicative movement speed as well as skill speed actually. So uh yeah, 19 haste with 200% effect is a lot of movement speed. So you can see here I have 11.7 movement speed. I'll have my haste up. I have 51. That's 5 times. So that's 5 times movement speed, that's 5 times damage. And basically the same goes with skill speed, right? That's 5 times skill speed. That's just a lot of damage. And this is global, so which means every time this loops, it gets multiplied again, again, again. And so that's the biggest scaler. But for the other relics, so King's Contract is obviously core to the build, right? You make your summon the big beefy guy with the crazy amount of HP. And then we have these 3 here for the global damage scaling. We have 40% more, 50% more, and 15% more per element, which is in total 45% more. Right, all of these are global, all of these gets scaled every time. Here, Lucky Leaf is for defense, which I'll talk about later. Explosive Orb is core to the loop. And Celestial Center is just for area effect, because you want some global area effect, so when these explosions go off, they can chain to each other and to create the loop, right? And then we have more global stuff with Spirit Power for fire damage. This works on both. This works on everything basically, right? Fire damage works on everything. Area damage only works on the hit part. It does not work on the ignite, so it works for your sacrifice itself, and it works for explosive orb. And the corrosion, which gives damage over time, only works on the ignite, obviously. Yeah. And for carrying power, we just have like ignite effect, global ignite effect, and then global fire damage and area damage. For the skill tree, it's the same, right? You just get like these global 10% more fire damage, and then we're using infusion for the first one. For the global 20% more damage, that's scaled by infusion effect here and here. And then we have 15% more for each element, so that's 45% in total. And then here, this is just for recovery, and then 20% more movement speed, right? And then cooldown is also good. That's how the global scaling works. Also, there's the Abyssal Eye, I guess. So Dancer got nerfed recently, a pretty big nerf. It got capped to 100%. So before it was uncapped, so the 5% more damage per 1 movement speed can go up like crazy. But yeah, now it's capped at 100%, which means as long as you have 20 movement speed, you have the max. And Dancer in total gives us 25% more for the first 2, and then 100% more for the third. And the first 2 is additive with each other, so it's 1.5 times 2, so it's 3 times damage in total. And this is global. Again, very good. And yeah, that's about it for the global scaling. Now, sure, we do infinite damage. Sure, it's really strong, but still, we need to be able to kill at least one enemy, right, to start the loop. And for that, you have to have very strong initial damage as well. So to scale the initial damage, outside of just the global damage modifiers, I'm using some new tech that's been introduced. Well, mostly it's just a new Abyssal Eye. So there are 6 new Abyssal Eyes that got added, which is the 6 down here. And for this build, Sage is extremely powerful. So what Sage does is the first one just has 15% more skill power, right? The second one has each different type of slate you use on the skill gives that skill 5% skill power. So in total, you have 7 slates per skill. So that's 35% more skill power for that skill if you use 7 different slates. Now the third is if you have 7 different slates, the skill has 150% more skill power. And these 3 lines are multiplicative with each other. So it's 1.15 times 1.35 times 2.5. And that's, I think, like 3.8 or something. So yeah, it's a crazy amount of damage. It's probably the most damage you can get on Abyssal Eye right now. With obviously the downside of having to use different slates. But if you can get around that, it's very strong for any build. But it's even stronger for this build because if you remember from my previous video, the way how sacrifice works is, well, sacrifice does a percentage of the HP of the minion that you sacrificed, and both sacrifice, the percentage of the sacrifice, and the HP of the minion is scaled by skill power. So by scaling skill power, you're basically double dipping, right? You're scaling both the HP and the percent. So the 3.8 instead gets basically, it turns from if you think about it, it's 4 times damage turns into 16 times damage, which makes it even stronger than what we were using before, which is Flesh Pagoda, right? So I completely dropped Flesh Pagoda. Flesh Pagoda needs too much investment in HP, so I completely dropped it. I have no investment in HP. I only have 930 HP. And we're just using different slates on our skills, right? 7 different slates. No more duplicate slates anymore. And well, that gives us a lot of damage. Yeah, and then we also have Trapper. Trapper gives 15% more displacement skill power. Displacement skill is just movement skill. It's just translation issue. And then 15% more. And then 60% more from the traps buff you get. And this only affects the minion. So it doesn't double dip because sacrifice does not have the movement tag. But it's still decent for damage. It's okay. It's not great. This is actually mostly for survivability, which we'll talk about later. And yeah, Nimble Hunter also gives 20% more projectile skill power and 20% more displacement skill power, which is, well, again, both of these are on the summon. The summon has both of these tags, projectile and movement skill. So it's just some damage. Nothing too crazy. And I guess let's talk about the slates. So we have to use 7 different slates, which means there are some slates that's gonna be a bit weaker, but because we get such a big payoff from Sage, it's still worth using. So for the summon itself, we're gonna use Infusion because we use Infusion on the skill tree also. So we need a way to get the Infusion buff anyways, right? We have to have the Infusion buff for this to work. So Infusion is 30% more skill power. That's pretty good. Cohesion, 40% more power. Very good. Over release is 20% more power per charge. For the summon skill, it will basically always be at 2 charges. So this is basically 40% more. And I will talk about why it always have 2 charges later. But yeah, a rapid cooling because, well, we want to lower the cooldown for better DPS, right? Fast because, well, it's faster cast speed, it's more DPS. Charge is 20%, 30% more damage. Very good. And, well, actually, no, 30% more damage doesn't do anything because we want skill power. The damage doesn't do anything. But charge also makes the skill have a movement tag. And like I said before, Trapper only affects skills with movement tags as well as the Nimble Hunter, right? So this is just to give the skill the movement tag. And then automatic because, well, This build is for AFK use. And for the sacrifice, again, automatic, fast, cast speed, fire for damage, infusion, skill power, cohesion skill power, crit damage for, well, crit damage. And if you look at the skill, it has 650% crit damage. 150% comes from the slate here. And so that's about like 25% damage, I think. Like around there. So yeah, it's decent for a slate. It's definitely worth using. And then the last one I'm using Elemental Disintegration, which puts a defense debuff on the enemy. Now, originally I always used this slate on like a support skill, but after further testing, I found that it doesn't seem to work if it's not on the skill you're using. So I don't know if it's a bug or like maybe it's some issue with my testing, but for some reason, if I don't put Elemental Disintegration on the skill itself, it doesn't benefit the skill. So yeah, I don't know what's going on, honestly. Yeah, and there isn't really any better slates to use anyways. So Elemental Disintegration is just what I chose to use. So that's for the slate setup. And for our third skill, we're using Mikiri with automatic Fury Haste just for the buffs, tuning also for the cooldown buff, and then the rest fast is for just faster cast speed, and then these two are kind of just support skills. Frozen to freeze enemies if they manage to hit you. And Trample is just to release a big AoE when you use Mikiri. But for some reason, I don't think Trample works with Mikiri, even though it says it works with movement skills. I've never seen it proc. Like I don't see the effect go off ever. So I don't know if it works or not, honestly. Or maybe you can replace it with something else, but there really isn't other stuff I think you can use. So yeah. And Mikiri is also, now I'm talking about Mikiri, and let's talk about the survivability. So Mikiri is basically how this build lives. And like you can see, there's absolutely no HP, only 930. No resistance, no damage reduction, no block, no, like there's nothing about it. It's like there's no way this build can survive, right? Well, Mikiri gives a buff as a buff called See-Through, and when you have this buff, you are basically able to take a free hit. And that hit will not be able to kill you. And remember, this only affects hits. So dots will not, you will not be able to tank dots with Mikiri. But from my experience, you seem to do fine against dots anyways, probably because they come out too slow and you kill them before the dot applies to you. So yeah, Mikiri allows you to take a free hit. You will still take damage, but if that damage was supposed to kill you, you will instead go to 1 HP, and then Mikiri will full heal you after that. So you will basically always have a one-shot protection with Mikiri, but Mikiri has a very long skill cooldown, and we're just trying to get Mikiri cooldown as low as possible, and that's why we're using so many weird stuff. And the first thing is Trapper, right? Trapper says minus 20% displacement skill cooldown, and then all three added together is minus 80%. This is minus cooldown, which is additive. This isn't cooldown recovery. This is basically cooldown reduction. So it removes 80% of your cooldown in total. So if you have 1 second cooldown, it will be 0.2 second cooldown instead. So this is extremely powerful in making your cooldown very, very short. And as you can see here, my cooldown for Mikiri is 0.17, right? That's pretty good, but it can still be better. And that's why we're using Nimble Hunter. Nimble Hunter, if you look at the last line, after using a projectile skill, reduce the cooldown of displacement skill, which is movement skill, by 0.25 seconds. So when we use a projectile skill, our movement skill gets reduced by 0.25 seconds. Now, what happens if there's a skill that's both a projectile skill and a movement skill? Well, our summon is both a projectile skill and a movement skill. So, whenever you use this skill, it reduces its own cooldown and Mercury's cooldown by 0.25, which Mercury is lower than 0.25, which means Mercury has no cooldown. And because this skill, I managed to get it to under 0.25, actually exactly 0.25, so the skill also has no cooldown, which is why I say over release always has 2 charges for this skill, because this skill has no cooldown. And well, sacrifice using over release only has, oh wait, no, I'm not using over release on sacrifice, sorry. But yeah, with this, with summon, you always have 2, and if you look at it, you like sometimes it's 1, but a lot of times it's actually 2. So yeah, it's just like crazy, right? And Mercury basically has no cooldown. Yeah, so that's how the defense works. You have almost no cooldown on your one-shot protection. You're basically only capped by your release time, because during the release time you can still get killed if you get like hit during if you get hit twice during the release time, right? So the release time is 0.004, and if you get hit twice during that, so if the first hit will be eaten by see-through, right? But the second hit will kill you if you don't have the buff up again. And that's why we're trying to scale dodge and try and not get hit twice during that very short period. And that's why you're using Lucky Leaf, right? So Lucky Leaf says dodge chance will be counted 2 times, which means if you don't dodge a hit, you will count the dodge again and try and dodge it a second time. And what this effectively means is, well, if you look at the Lucky Leaf, there's also 50% less dodge chance and then minus 5% maximum dodge chance. 50% less dodge chance is, well, it just means you have to have twice the amount of dodge to cap your dodge. It should make scaring a little bit harder, but not a big deal. Minus 5% maximum dodge chance is very big, however. So normally the default maximum dodge chance is 70%. With the minus 5 here, it will be 65%. Now you can get some maximum dodge chance from some different sources, and I'll show you here. And you can think about getting it, but I chose not to because you lose way too much damage. But here you have maximum dodge chance, 5% on the Hermit tree, right? And there's also 5% from Mind's Eye Warrior. If you have 3 Mind's Eye Warrior, you have 5% maximum dodge rate also, so you can get it to 75%. Now, to illustrate how strong 75% maximum dodge chance compared to 65, which is what we have right now, do some calculations. So, if I have 75% maximum dodge chance and I have dodge count twice with Lucky Leaf, so effectively I will have, first of all, I have 0.25 chance to get hit, right? Because we have 75% dodge chance. Now, 0.25 chance to get hit, counted twice, well, that's 0.25 times 0.25 is 0.0625, which is 6.25% chance to get hit, which is, well, 93.75% dodge chance. That's very high, right? Compared to 75%, 93% is very, very high. Now, in our case, I'm using 65% only, so that's a lot weaker, but let's see how much weaker. So 65% dodge chance, which means I have effectively 35% chance to get hit. And then that's, if I have Lucky Leaf, I have 12% chance to get hit. And that's, well, 1 minus, that's 87.75% dodge chance, which is still very high, but that's basically twice the chance compared to like maximum 75% dodge chance. So yeah, this has half as much survivability compared to if you were to go like 75% max dodge. But if you want to go 75% max dodge, you have to use the Hermit tree, which is very weak for this build because the talents don't really do anything for damage. And the tree itself is not great. It has haste, sure, but compared to, because you can't really drop this tree, this is too strong, which means you have to drop this tree, but this tree is just so much damage. And yeah, you will lose so much damage by doing that, and I just don't think it's worth. And well, you can potentially use Mind's Eye Warrior instead of maybe Dancer, but yeah, that's, if you want to experiment with it, you can. I chose not to go Mind's Eye Warrior because I find even with 65% dodge chance, I'm completely fine doing normal content. Like perhaps with more dodge chance, you can go deeper for the Infinite Abyss. But yeah, that's how I scale my build right now. And I think that's about it for the build. Yeah, it's very strong. And oh yeah, also I guess I kind of want to talk about like this whole scaling because um if you think about it, this way of scaling is actually very generic, very global, which means it will basically work on any skill. Almost any skill can run this package, which is kind of problematic to be honest, because this is probably the best way to scale damage right now with the movement speed scaling, with wing blade, with haste, with stuff like dancer, and then also the defensive scaling with Lucky Leaf, with dodge, with Mikiri cooldown. And not all skills can abuse Trapper plus Nimble Hunter, but you can at least always run Trapper, which still makes the Mikiri very low cooldown. And you just gonna run this glass cannon, dodge, one shot protection, defense. Uh, which I mean it's cool, but if it's used on every build, then it kind of kills all the build diversity, right? So I think it is a little problematic and perhaps should be nerfed or changed. But we'll see what the dev does for this build, or like for this whole scaling mechanic. But yeah, very strong build, and I hope you enjoy this build.